So welcome to another astrology podcast, and this is more free form because I'm not going to be reading anything. I just want to freestyle on this, and sometimes it turns out to be the best strategy. Now, in this particular free form podcast, I want to talk about a particular placement. I want to talk about Pluto in the second house. So first of all, I have a podcast regarding the nature of Pluto. It's called The Implications of Disowned Sexual Desire. And what it simply, in summary, what it simply means is that Pluto represents or signifies that aspect of human consciousness that is very far removed from the self awareness of the sun. And in the far reaches, in the far depths of the psyche, it represents a compulsive, obsessive fear of death. That's what it really means. So, and because it is so far deep within the psyche, that fear is essentially intertwined with the regenerative aspects of our being, which is sexuality. And so Pluto also signifies that the raw sexuality, very raw. But in an additional twist of understanding, Pluto also signifies the nature of our authenticity. It is the nature of our primal desires, the authentic self that is independent of all moral judgment. That's really what it is. So it is, and in that way, it is very primitive. And it is its primitivity that allows it to be so powerful within the psyche. Because it's not something that you can really control with your will. The only way to, because if you read the mythology surrounding the Greek mythology surrounding Hades and Pluto and all that, he was literally the archetype of the underworld. Now, I want you to understand that those mythologies are not really, they're myths, but they're not just fanciful stories. They are describing something that you can't really focus on except through narrative like that. And they're describing the structure of self-awareness, the structure of human awareness. Now, how these mythologies evolved, they evolved from experimental observation. That's how these stories came about. They didn't just come about because somebody had a fanciful idea. No. In the observation of human behavior, cause and effect, the structure of karma. Okay, I'll explain what karma is a bit later. So it is based on this envelope, this structure of the dynamics of human consciousness, that all these energies were, or all these aspects were delineated. There are still other aspects that are not given names yet, that operate within the psyche as a whole, as a totality. But they haven't been named, and so they remain unidentified. I mean, astrology is not precise simply because all the entire spectrum of psychic of psychic compulsions or psychic energies are not fully delineated. Now, a full and total delineation of the overall human cycle, that would be something truly incredible, truly incredible. And you see, okay, because even today you can't really have that because companies, the social media companies, which interact with everybody and everybody interacts with them. For every like you have is a personality profile because it details what you like, how you like it, how many hours it took you to like. It contains snippets of the underlying motivations of the human. So something like a company like Facebook, ultimately transitions into Meta because everybody's been clicking, liking, and sharing and whatever. All those things are basically spectral, or they reveal the spectral nature of motivations underlying human behavior. And with the spectral nature, just like a Fourier series, you can reconstruct the original underlying motivations and then use that to build an environment within which people can now download their cognition into so that it feels more realistic, so that it feels more natural. Because the environment, the prescriptions for building the environment were gotten from the desires, the root motivations of the individuals themselves. That is your Facebook business model. That's really what it is. It's not just Facebook, it's all the social media, every digital company, this is what they're doing. So I guess Zuckerberg, being the kind of person that he is, decided, you know what, I'm gonna get there first because it represents a huge potential. It's called first mover advantage. Okay. First mover doesn't mean that you're going to be successful. It just means that you are there first, and you can define the rules of engagement for future entrants. Okay, enough of that. Back to Pluto. It's really not outside the discussion because Pluto also represents power. It's the subterranean nature of power. Okay, because like I was saying, Pluto is the mythology of Pluto in Hades is that he rules the underworld in a sense, and in that underworld, every single thing that human beings do not want to face up about themselves is thrown there. Everything, you know. So if you can't face yourself, or you find a reason why you just don't want to face yourself, it's most likely it's because you have this basement that is full of stuff you don't want to confront, and that becomes the material upon which a Pluto transit works on when time comes. Okay, so Pluto basically represents that, and I'm going to give more descriptions, but they all are the same thing. That's the point I'm trying to make. Whether as a lord of the underworld, or Pluto represents power, or the primitive sexual impulse, it's all describing one simple thing in effect. Do you understand? It's describing what a human being or human awareness or human consciousness looks like when it is so remote from the self-consciousness of the sun. So it is almost literally animalistic in a sense. So it is the way you behave when you want to seek advantage, when you want to pursue power, when you want to have the upper hand, when you want to, because it is so primitive. You can see animals, the way they behave. Animals don't wear clothes. Why do you think that is so? In fact, one of the defining features of the human psyche is that human beings wear clothes. And not only do they wear clothes, they wear clothes, additional clothes, on their private parts. You see? And the reason is because that is the part that is most intimate, the part that is most true, the part that is most authentic. And it may surprise you to then learn that sacredness is defined by these things. When something is very sacred, it is treated very differently. I know it must come as a shock, but I've just used the word primitive, animalistic, and all that. Yeah, but those words don't connote evil per se. They just connote a state of being wherein which absolutely free. Because look at the dogs, for instance. A dog never stops and says, you know what exactly am I really? Why do I walk on four? Why am I the way that I am? If you met such a dog, man, nobody, everyone would just be frightened of that kind of dog. You see, a dog just goes about being a dog. It doesn't, they feel no shame because there's no sense of self to feel shameful about. Now, when a human being begins to recognize its own awareness, it begins to hide itself. And the hiding process comes, the first place that's how you know that a self-realization or self-awareness has begun to materialize is because there is a point now from which the individual psyche stands and stares at its primitive nature. And it doesn't really like what it sees, so it seeks to cover it up immediately. Do you know why? Because it represents its intimate truth, its vulnerability. Okay? So Pluto is very, very vulnerable. And that's why those who have prominent placements in the Scorpio personality archetype, their initial material that they have to work with before all the descriptions of transformation, etc., the original material with which they have to work with is fear. The fear of death. Okay? So that's what Pluto really, really, really is, in a sense. It's this fear. Now, when this, just a little bit about the second house. Now, to understand the second house, you have to understand the first house. What is going on in the first house? Now, the first house contains the most important aspect of the chart, which is the ascendant. And the ascendant it's a mathematical point, really. It's an angular point. It's not really a body per se, or like a body of psychic energy, like a planetary influence is. So you say, why is the ascendant so important? I will tell you. The ascendant is important because it is that point that conditions the metric, the way every experience that is going to cycle through the 12 natal houses, it conditions how they all are calibrated. So it is that ascendant that picks the starting point of every house. If you're running the for instance, the Placidus system, okay, which is the system that I run or I use, or the system that I've come to know. I don't believe in whole houses because I can't just accept the fact that an area of human awareness is completely matched by a psychological impulse, which is how houses begin. I don't believe in clear-cut boundaries between these things. I believe in fuzziness. These things fade into each other, and sometimes it's almost very difficult to find out where something starts and where it ends. You see, I think it's one of the great strengths of astrology that it is fuzzy, because what we are trying to describe is a human consciousness, and human consciousness is not fuzzy, at least the way we understand it. Because if human consciousness is not precise, sorry to say, it is fuzzy. Because if it were very precise and we found all the rules for describing human consciousness, you would build an artificial intelligence that can mimic human consciousness. Now, I have done a lot of work in this area. I've actually written a book. And it serves as the underlying motivation for my interest in astrology. The delineation of what's really going there. Because one of the key attributes of being self-aware is that we can begin to describe not just the world around us, but the nature of how we are. And that represents another stage in the development of our consciousness. Because after self-consciousness, what comes next? Prior to self-consciousness, you can see the animals and the way they are. That's their level of consciousness, their level of awareness. And I know a lot of people, I've met a lot of people who talk about that, animals are self-aware, they're this, they're that. No, they have a consciousness, so they exist as a state of being. But what that being really is, it doesn't have a focal point from which they can observe themselves. This is a fundamentally different point of view. They cannot objectify themselves or the universe around them. The process of objectification, that's how you begin to build, because the sun in the sky is the central point. And it is that central point, going up, coming down, going up over billions of years. That is what is implanted in your head as a sense of self, a sense of oneness. Do you understand? Cool. So, the ascendant now becomes the way that an individual perceives themselves. And when I say this, what I mean is that the story that you are telling yourself about who you are, how you are, that is your ascendant. And it's a very private process. And this contrasts with most of what you're going to get out there in astrology. Most astrologers will tell you that your ascendant is the point where the way other people see you. That I respectfully disagree. In my personal opinion, the ascendant is a very private point. It is the way that you see yourself. Okay? The way other people see you is on your descendant. Because it is at your descendant that you meet other people. Prior to that, your ascendant is one of the most intimate points, because that's what you are before the establishment of self-awareness. Okay? So it's very, very instinctual, and it's something that only you really know and can experience. And so that is the natural spark, natural point at which awareness comes into existence. I once described it as the place where a newly born infant takes its first gulp of air. And air is not just air. Air contains oxygen, because that's the part that really interacts and the lungs of an infant in the womb, they are crumpled up. It means that they have never been inflated before. They're built in a very crumpled state. Now, when an infant is born, the change of awareness of its environment, because now they feel the contrast between hot and cold. They've never really felt that before because the internal womb is kept at a constant temperature. The shock forces them to open up their mouth and their nostrils. Once they do that, they let in a rush of oxygenated air into their lungs. And oxygen is a corrosive gas. It burns. And that first imprint of pain, burning in the lungs, that imprint is plastered into the brain. Because the sensation of pain needs to be picked up by your lungs, by your brain. That is your ascendant point. Okay? It is the first point of experiential awareness as a being. So and at that point, a child does not realize that it has a physical form. It has never ever occurred to it that it has a physical form. The process by which human consciousness experiences a physical form, that is the nature of the second house, really. Because in the first house, the infant does not realize that it is a self or it is a thing. It just is by virtue of the fact that it is. And that is the essential dynamic of the first house. And I know this contrasts with it because a lot of people think that the first house is your body and I don't really hold on to those kind of views. I just believe that your first house is how you perceive your sense of self. If you perceive your sense of self through your body, then if you perceive your sense of self through your body, you can't really interpret that because the interpretation is done in the second. Because the perception that you feel as your body is basically an exploration and categorization of your material senses, and that does not take place in the first. It takes place in the second, and that brings us to the issues of the second house, where Aries is just the sense of beingness without form. I am. That's it. I just I is or I am. I cannot tell you exactly how I am because I don't know. In Taurus, knowing begins to come. What we call experiential awareness begins to build. And the first step at which it is built is that the child realizes that it has a body. And it begins to derive meaning or sense of pleasure from this body. And the first point for that sense of pleasure comes from this process of suckling. The mouth, taste. It's not even sight per se, it's taste. That is what begins to restructure the sense of being. And that's why for those who are second house dominant or Taurus dominant, really nice food. That's the key. Well-made food. Tasty. Just feed them. Okay? So that's essentially the second house. So the second house is dominated by the sense of material pleasure or pain. But it feels very material because it feels very sensual because it's coming through the senses, you see. So the second house is an engagement of the senses in the definition of physical form. That is the underlying development that takes place within that second house. So when you have the psychological archetype of Pluto now immersed within that second house, then a deep fear is now inserted into the sensual definition of material form. You know what the feeling is like? It feels like the fear becomes like you are losing your body. And what happens when you lose your body? You're dead. You see? So the fear the feeling that is generated by that placement of Pluto in the second house is like it's like a feeling, a fear of a deep fear of death. But that is now expressed as a fear of losing your connection to the things that bring you pleasure or pain. You see, but because it's Taurus, the essential archetype of Taurus is to investigate. So in the initial development of a Taurian personality, the psyche investigates and experiments with a lot of material sensations. What they are and this is done quite early. So what they're looking for is that sweet spot, the comfort zone. Because the young Taurian is constantly making an assessment. Does it give me pleasure or does it give me pain? Does it give me pleasure? Does it give me pain? So over time, they assimilate so much input, informational input from this calculus. And once that has reached a sufficient point in terms of criticality of information, then the final assessment is made. And once that is done, they have found a comfort zone. And once that final comfort zone is found, that's it. They sink in and that's it. They don't move anymore. It's almost, if you've succeeded in getting a Taurian, someone who is very dominant with Taurian qualities to move or change their minds, well, you've done something that, most people will consider a miracle. But they don't, you see? And that is because Taurus is the impulse that is fed into the receptacle of the second house naturally in the natural chart. But it doesn't matter what sign is sitting on the cusp of the second house. The essential demand of the house is the same. So, for instance, if there's Libra sitting on the cusp of the second house, what the second house needs is that Taurian effect, and it must be taken from Libra. So what will happen is the psychological archetype or the combination will investigate the essential dynamics of Libra to retrieve Taurian qualities from that Libra, even though Libra is an air sign. You understand? So the houses, the demands of the houses don't really change per se. The effects of the houses are modified by the planetary archetypes that are placed within the houses. But what the house needs essentially is the same. It wants to feel the sense of material self. It wants to be able to organize its reality based on its pleasure impulse. And when Pluto sits in this house, this requirement goes into the depth of the psyche, the primitive part. It now becomes an existential issue where the individual feels that if they cannot connect this aspect, this pleasurable aspect of themselves, it feels like dying. So what the individual fears, and if you make the essential leap or the essential leap of logic into modern day reality, how do you guarantee pleasurable whatever? It's most likely that if you have material resources like money, okay, then you can explore the pleasurable aspects of your life more easily than when you don't have any money. You see? So once the individual makes the connection between pleasure and money, then that focus, that primitive instinct, that essential drive, right, focuses on money. That's really what it is. And so the individual fears poverty more than anything else in life. They will do anything to avoid it. And that brings us to the second part, because most astrological texts will describe Pluto as having a cathartic effect. They will tell you that Scorpio is transformational, Pluto is transformational. Yeah, but what does it mean? Because a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. Are you telling me that from caterpillar you're going to be... What is the essential nature of a transformation? I'll tell you. The essential nature of a transformation as triggered by Scorpio or Pluto is the coming to terms with powerlessness. That is how you get your power. Because what the psyche is that it is free as it emanates of itself. It has no form. That's really what it is. The process of emergence into physical reality is the taking on of form and function. You see? Now, to free the soul, because what really the essential aspect of life is to be free, even contained in physical reality, to be able to express the freedom of the soul, to be the freedom of the soul, even though you are encased within a material reality. And the process of doing that elevates material reality from the confinement that it naturally implies to a divine state. You can't do that when you are a slave to your material senses. And that is what Pluto is there for. The job of, because what is an obsessive compulsive desire? Which is how Pluto expresses itself in the psyche. An obsessive compulsive desire makes you a slave to your impulses. Because it's so far from the sun, your will can't penetrate it. You cannot react in any way. You are driven by things that basically are out of your control. even though somehow they're related, they're coming from you. You see? So you are drawn by feelings, very primitive feelings that you can't seem to do anything about. And when they begin to manifest negatively, you're drawn by jealousy, rage, envy, the lust for power, control, manipulation, possessiveness, all these things. But the root of all of that is still coming from the same place. So we can have positive expressions, which is what happens after the transformation, or you can have very negative expressions. So there are two aspects to the energy of Pluto and Scorpio. This is what defines them, and that's the nature of that transformation that people talk about. You see? So the essential thing about when Pluto finds itself in the second house is it is a reckoning between it's a reckoning for true freedom. Now, what it feels like dying. Like I've said. So I don't see anybody who rushes into you would just want to go and kill yourself. No, what the natural instinct is for the preservation of life. So nobody wants to die. So the thing is that when these people, during the course of their development, when they encounter situations that begin to give them that existential threat, they run away from it. It's not something that they just can't know. They don't really make a decision the legs just start moving figuratively. Whatever it is, they just detach from it and try to escape it. And that is the essence of the mirror that Hades possesses, Pluto. Pluto has a mirror. And what the mirror does is that when you look into it, you see the authentic nature of yourself. Okay? So that's what it wants. It wants you to be able to look in the mirror and not run. What are you running from? You cannot run from yourself. So and this is an essential aspect of human behavior, because when you are a slave to something, for instance, addiction or drugs or whatever, it's not the thing itself that you're addicted to. There's something else underneath, and that's what I'm trying to describe here. It's this fear. And the only way to overcome fear is to confront it. You have to take that fear and bring it into the light. And that's the power of therapy, some types of therapy. Because ultimately by running from that fear, what you are actually doing, you may think that you are avoiding the fear, but what you're actually doing is you are running into that fear, because you cannot run from yourself. So Pluto transits, what they do is when they come, they re-examine, depending on other factors in the chart, and also depending on the other timetables that, as they play out, not just the transits. They begin to re-examine, and the re-examination is the primitive aspect of yourself, that plutonic aspect of the self begins to wake up. It begins to become dissatisfied with the enslavement of itself. And so it wants to free itself, and the way it frees itself is by destroying that fear. And the way it does that is to bring the sun. It brings the sun into that fear. And this is an extremely terrifying process. Because it is what it's described as an ego death. So the sense of self disintegrates. It becomes powerless because you are now caught in the plutonic cycles and the self-destruct or the destructiveness and all of that. Now, the reason for doing that is to dislodge, to kind of dislodge the fixed kind of, because you are held in bondage, literally. So to free you from that, it needs to dislodge you from that. And that sense of self, like, I gave a podcast about the nature of the sense of self. It's a very detailed podcast because it contains insights that I don't know if they have been shared anywhere else. But it talks about the sense of self as being something that is constructed by the individual gradually over time. It doesn't exist at birth per se. It exists as a potential for construct. And it is in that sense that the sense of self is a scheme. A mathematical scheme. Okay? And then what the individual does is over time is they build that sense of self by collecting pieces, fragments of maybe what you call information. But it's not really info, because you can collect even a memory, a very distant memory, or the way something looks, just the shape, the form of it. You take it and you use it. So the sense of self is a jumble. It's like a mess of totally, maybe sometimes even unrelated things. But the relationship between all those things, that is the nature of that self that is being constructed. So it is within the self that you can find connections between things that don't even relate to each other at all. In my ebook, The 5 Principles of Organized Complexity, I call this process the convergence of knowledge spaces. Okay? So as it applies to this Plutonic effect, it feels like a disintegration of that construction. Everything begins to break down. And the individual begins to thrash and look for alternatives. You're fighting. It's almost like you're drowning. Catharsis happens when you realize that there is absolutely nothing you can do. You're finished. You just have to surrender. It is by surrendering that you now go into, you're not afraid now to look, because he who is down fears no fall. You're not afraid to look into the mirror of Pluto anymore, because what else can it do to you? Okay? You are free now. What you should be doing is you should be rejoicing. You should be giving, you should be dancing, because now you have finally lost everything. Nothing is holding you anymore. Nobody expects anything from you anymore. You're literally like a bum. But what it does is it presents you with an amazing opportunity to rebuild the self along more authentic lines of expression that will now empower you, because you have no fear. You're not a slave to that aspect of your nature anymore. You have risen above it. And you will now see the other side of this transformative experience. It empowers you, because anything that Pluto touches, it empowers, it accentuates. Okay? And after a few years of that accentuation, of that empowerment, you will laugh at the fact that you were once a slave to these things that, that is the essential aspect. That is why Pluto is the psychological archetype of Pluto is said to rule the cycles of nature that create and destroy, or that destroy and create. You see? And Pluto also rules power, in the sense that there are 2 ways to acquire power. You can forcefully take power from everyone, or people can give you power. There's a difference. One is very karmic, very unstable. The other one is very, very solid. It's literally, it is bestowed. So it's not something that can easily be removed or taken. It is literally almost like earned. So it's not a question that people are forced to give you power. No. They delight. It is an honor for them to bestow upon you that power. And so these are the 2 extremes of the Plutonic archetype of power, where one is perceived as a scorpion and the other is perceived as an eagle or a phoenix or whatever you want to call it. You see? But you can see that in the long term, during this overall discussion, what I'm really talking about is a transformation in the sexual urge, the primitive sexual urge. Because it is that primitive sexual urge that is responsible for one of the most debilitating human emotions, which is jealousy. It is from jealousy that every other, because nobody wants to admit that they're really jealous and envious, and they would rather not see somebody make it or something. So they hide it. You see? They conceal it. But concealing is that the only person you're damaging in that process is yourself, because you're concealing yourself from yourself. And so by doing so, you split yourself into 2, where you create an aspect of yourself that you no longer want to consider because it doesn't make you feel good. And then you create an aspect of yourself that is entirely false. And so life becomes the process of managing these 2 things. And as you go on, you divide into more and more and more. And before you know what's happening, you're a mess. You see? Because with each division comes the division of thought forms. And thought forms, you have to keep track of them. And before you know what's happening, it becomes an unwieldy mess. And when a transit comes around, it just begins to destroy all of that. It's because it's not the transit per se, it is the aspect of you that is just too annoyed with all that rubbish. Okay, so Pluto in the 2nd house, the general pattern most likely is The initial stage is where the individual does whatever it takes to avoid poverty. They literally, they will cheat, lie, steal, betray. They will encounter feelings of jealousy. They will work towards destabilizing other people. Because they want to have power in that area. So they will do whatever to try to get that. They will tell themselves whatever kind of lies they need to tell. They will lie to other people. They will sabotage. They will, all sorts of things driven by the desire to have access to that thing that makes them so comfortable. If it's money, well, that's what it is. You see? And the way and manner, the context for that is what is provided by the sign on the cusp. Now, this process goes on until, depending on other factors within the chart, okay? I'm not saying that it must go in this way, because the chart must be looked at as a whole. You can't examine individual parts, even though sometimes we must examine parts for deeper understanding of those parts. So what happens is, at some point in time, the enslavement, which essentially is the corruption of the self, of that aspect of the self, becomes so toxic that even they can't stand themselves anymore. But it doesn't express itself in the conscious mind. It is taking place at a place that the will cannot penetrate. Otherwise, you can will yourself to continue doing what you're doing, But after a while, in order to save you, otherwise you become sick. Psychologically, the mind breaks down and fragments. So the archetype of Pluto does not allow this. What it does is it has to clean house. So when a transit comes along, and depending on other things in the chart, it begins to investigate. It begins to force the individual at that level of depth to look into the mirror of Hades. And they don't like what they see. Then it begins the process of dismantling all of that it doesn't like. And the individual begins to experience a crisis. Now, depending on other factors within the chart, the crisis is externalized as events, people. And because it's Pluto, it's usually within relationships. Maybe betrayals in a friend, or sabotage from work, or so. It just begins to play. The essential dynamic, where it is going, is to deconstruct the sense of self that has been built on a falsehood, so as to allow a more authentic expression. Because what is the more authentic expression of Pluto in the second house? They are not afraid of poverty. So they are willing to actually go through the difficult process of empowering themselves in the process, in the way that they accumulate wealth, not other people's wealth, their own personal powerful wealth that makes them powerful. And the only way they accumulate is because it is bestowed upon them as a recognition of what it is that they are. So, if the Taurus is basically your own individual pleasure of how your material sense, or your material world. Pluto in the second house is the empowerment of that sense of self. That's really what it is. And in order to become that empowered, you have to basically, you got to do it yourself. But because you don't know how, because that is what the Pluto does, the fact that you don't know how, that is what generates the anxiety deep within the psyche, that directly implies that the moment you try to walk on your own, you will fall. Not only will you will fall so far deep that you might end up bankrupt, homeless, or whatever it is, in a very unpleasurable, situation. So this is what the individual is, or whoever it is avoiding, or the native is avoiding. Now, what happens after the transformation is phenomenal. Because during the transformation, and the transformative process has been described as trying to pass through the eye of a needle, or trying to get a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. You see, I mean, with your normal senses and the normal realizations of the world, of the normal world, you know that this is impossible. But what we're talking about is an alchemical process, a process of transformation. And when something transforms alchemically from one thing to another, it's been described as the what? As the philosopher's stone, where the lead is transformed into gold. I mean, today in the area of nuclear science and all that, we can see how such a thing can become possible. But in the age when all of this was being discussed, this was literally just like saying that something is impossible, even though it happens. So by logic, it's impossible, and yet it happens. Okay? So that was what was used to describe the transformative process. So what happens is, after experiencing the powerlessness, The individual is no longer a slave to the area of this area of the second house, and they are now free. And in the process of becoming free, they learn everything that needs to be known about the operations of that second house. So the fear is gone. They no longer are ignorant about the process of empowering themselves. They have learned how to do it, probably in a very difficult way. And then they now proceed to create wealth. And Pluto in the second house is big money, because it's Pluto, But it is money that you need to get from the side of yourself that you have concealed. So that's really what it is. I mean, and that is the Pluto in the second house. But you have to understand that the second house is also like a Venusian house, because it's Taurus. So you find other iterations of this same principle in whenever Pluto meets Venus, because it's a very sexual contact. Anything between Pluto and Venus. In fact, some of the sexiest people you will ever meet have a very strong aspect between Pluto and Venus. So if it's a Venus square Pluto, right, the native is if it's a very strong, very almost exact or very strong aspect, in the square, it's because a square is a very creative thing. But what a square is a blockage in the mind. It means that the individual does not understand their sexuality the way that they are, and the value of it, because Venus square Pluto is a very powerfully sexual contact, even in synastry, you see. But the problem is because the square implies that the individual does not understand the measure of their power, and so they go too far or they underperform. They just can't get the calibration right. Now, the process of transformation is the individual or whoever, the native, finds themselves in a powerless situation that is brought about by the power of their sexuality. Maybe they've played some games or they've whatever, It usually comes out as an under or overestimation of their ability to love and their ability to be loved, or their ability to attract, or their ability for pleasure, or you can replace the terms whichever way. But that's how it comes out. So through some type of painful experience that involves sharing of some kind with another, the individual learns to calibrate that aspect of themselves properly, and that's when by experiencing that powerlessness, they are now ready to love themselves. By recognizing what they are now ready to love another. And those who have been transformed by Venus-Pluto contact or transit or whatever, if you really want to understand what real love, powerful love feels like, not just love as an ethereal quality, a powerfully sexual quality, then if you're lucky enough, you come across some of these people. You see? The trine simply brings the same issue of sexuality, but because the trine is such a pleasing form, the individual does not need to externalize the crisis. They can understand what it means, the resolution between these two aspects of themselves. They can understand it in such a way that the resolution becomes an internal thing. They can figure it out without having to act out all the drama and all the hurt and all the whatever. You see? That's really what it is. All right, I hope you've enjoyed listening to this freestyle impromptu, my details are somewhere if you really want to get chart analysis or synthesis or whatever it is. You can get in touch, send an email or direct message or whatever. All right.